Okay, I am going to quickly cover what I call the simple argument for the Catholic Church and the Papacy, um, or the Papacy and the Catholic Church. I don't know if this has already been presented. I'm not sure. I know that I've never seen it. I'm not making any absolute claim to being the first person to think of it, but I think it's compelling in its simplicity. And although there is more detail that I should go into in order to give it the full treatment that it deserves, I just thought in this video I would lay out the argument in its simplicity with minimal background and just see how that goes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to my slides, the so-called simple argument. Bear with the Drosta effect until I can get my slides up. All right, I'll hit slideshow and go up to the top. So here's the argument. I'm going to expand on my terms and premises as I walk through this argument as necessary. Number one, there is a true church. So what do I mean by church? I mean something very loose. I really just mean any set of theological claims that is believed by a community that meets regularly, or a community that meets regularly and who agree to some common set of theological views. And depending on how wide or loose the set, depending on how sort of generic or specific you believe the set of all true theological views to be, this term can cover it. At least it's designed to. Number two, it is truly important for all people to identify the true church with high confidence, including average people. So when I say truly important, I think maybe the way that I'm going to go with for the purposes of this argument is to say that finding the true church and assenting to its doctrines and practices and practicing them is necessary to maximize your closeness with God and or your chances of salvation, with two caveats. The first being that you are not doing so with a heart posture of trying to puff yourself up, but you're being humble. Like it says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. Hopefully you can hold to the fullness of correct theology that is contained in the true church with a spirit of love rather than pride. Because if you don't, then everyone would acknowledge that the theology isn't necessarily helping you. It's more of a stumbling block. And the second caveat is that you only have to believe and understand that which you have the capacity to believe and understand. At least with reasonable study. So it's not, in other words, I'm not saying that to maximize your closeness with God or your chances of salvation, you have to believe things that you can't really believe if they're too sort of intellectual or mysterious for the average person to believe. I just mean, within one's sort of natural limits. Okay, so yeah, it's truly important for all people to identify the true church with high confidence, including average people. The other thing to note about this definition of important is that if it's not important to find the true church for either of these purposes, if finding it doesn't maximize your closeness with God or your chances of salvation, it's not clear that it can be said to have any importance at all, at least from sort of the eternal standpoint or from God's standpoint, as it were. And whatever takes away from maximizing closeness with God, whatever hinders that or distracts from that is going to be a negative. So if finding the true church doesn't maximize your closeness with God, it would seem to follow that it's coming at the expense of whatever does maximize your closeness with God. So it's either sort of important in this way, or it's not important and probably harmful. So there's strong motivation to say that it's, I think, important along the following lines. Although there are, of course, caveats. There are further caveats here, because if you are just honestly mistaken about some theological issue, I don't think that's really going to hinder your closeness to God. If conceivably God can put you in a church for a season that's not necessarily the one true church, assuming that there is one, but he may do that so that you can learn more of theology from that church, like just because for whatever reason it is that style of presentation and those sorts of emphases that you would most benefit from in that season with your walk with God. But the idea is that if theological truth is on a gradient, and there's like more true and less true theological ideas, it stands to reason that in the limit there is this fullness of theological truth. And if God wanted us to ever have a realistic chance of finding that, we may imagine he will have providentially sort of kept all of those truths, at least all of the truths that have been expressed on earth in any sort of public way, bundled together in sort of one ecclesial package that we call the true church. So I'm going to have another presentation where I talk about this in greater detail. Hopefully this is enough detail for now. All the details of operationalization, which I get that they're important, but I'm just trying to make the argument as simple as possible for now. Premise 3, if it's truly important for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence, then God will have ensured that it is realistically possible for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence. So, what I mean by high confidence, I don't even necessarily mean, the way I'm using this, I don't even necessarily mean that the person making the identification himself is highly confident. Although I think normally they would be, but I don't necessarily mean that. I mean more so that when the person makes the identification, you can be highly confident as sort of the observer with perfect knowledge, so to speak. You can be highly confident. It's kind of like a gun that is loaded and in working order. If you hand it to someone that has never seen a gun before, and you tell them to pull the trigger, and they do pull the trigger, it's like it's going to work with high confidence, whether or not they're confident in its working. So I'm speaking more so to the method that one uses to identify the true church, that it is a highly accurate method. At least I think I mean that. I know I mean that at a minimum. Premise 4, the Catholic Church is the only church claiming that there is a method to identify the true church, which the Catholic Church identifies with itself, with high confidence that does not rest on personal theological knowledge or skill. And it is realistically possible for the average person to use this method, at least in the present day and during most points in history. And so what this method is this method of finding out the true church is just to determine who is the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome, and how do you get to be in communion with the Pope? What church do you join in order to be in communion with the Pope? And it's pretty common knowledge that that church is the Catholic Church. Just like the saying goes, is the Pope Catholic? So now the caveat here, of course, is there were points in history when it wasn't clear who the Pope was, because there would be like 2 or 3 claimants to the papacy at one time. These periods were short-lived, and I don't think that they had any effect on the doctrines and practices of the church, other than the question of who's Pope and which church should I be in to be in communion with the Pope, which is obviously pretty important. But if we're seeing the value of locating the one true church as being based on the fact that it lets you access the fullness of correct theology, I don't know that the fullness of correct theology was really substantially impacted during those periods. Anyway, so for most of history, it was pretty easy to identify the Pope. It is pretty easy to identify the Pope today. And of course, the question is just whether merely identifying the church, the Pope, is enough for you to be able to identify the true church with high confidence. That's the whole question. That's the whole premise that would be in dispute. Number 5, it is not realistically possible for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence based on their own theological knowledge and skill, unless this argument itself counts as theological knowledge, in which case it may be said to be the exception that proves the rule. So here's what I mean by this. If anyone saw the debate between Eric Ibarra and Ubi Petrus on the papacy, both gentlemen were extremely knowledgeable. They were both lay people. They were both non-professionals. I mean, they're professionals in their professions, but they're not professional theologians or historians. And nonetheless, yeah, their knowledge was impressive. They both seemed sincere. It didn't seem to me that either of them was in bad faith or intellectually honest, or intellectually dishonest, rather. At least not regarding their belief. Even if some of them were sort of intentionally or unintentionally twisting facts to support their arguments or narrative, I think at the core, their core conviction that what they were arguing for, it was honest, in the sense that I think they both, at the very least, can be said to sincerely believe that their respective churches are the true church. And what the practical import of this that I want to highlight is that when you consider the set of facts of which both of these men are aware, this set of facts may not be said to enable knowledge of the true church, because both of these men are aware of these facts, and yet they reach divergent conclusions on what the true church is. So I would not say, based on the shared set of facts that they are both aware of, that one can have knowledge of the true church, assuming, I guess also for the sake of argument, that they're both of roughly equal intelligence, and again, critically assuming that they're both in good faith and intellectually honest. It's not like that one of them sees the truth of the other side's position and suppresses it in unrighteousness, so to speak. I mean, it's possible in real life. I'm saying that, but in real life that's possible. I don't think so, but I'm saying for the purposes of this example, let's assume that neither one is doing that either. What that means is that set of facts doesn't enable knowledge of the true church. It doesn't let you have justified true belief, because it can't be that two people reach opposite conclusions based on the same set of facts, and that set of facts be sufficient for knowledge of one option as opposed to the other. And so whatever, if there is a set of facts that enables, a reasonably smart person, actually both of these men are probably significantly smarter than average, but if there is a set of facts that lets the average person know what the true church is, the cruel irony being the less intelligent you are, the more study you have to do in order to be able to identify the true church with high confidence based on your knowledge. But whatever the set of facts is that lets the average person know with high confidence that the church is the true church, I mean, like theological and historical facts, like just sort of basic first order doctrinal questions, historical questions. Whatever set of facts that is actually broader than what both of those men, than the overlap, between what each man in that debate knows. It's a broader set of facts. It's a more extensive set of facts, and that means it's more difficult for the average person to reach. I would say it's prohibitively difficult for the average person to reach. They can't be expected to have enough time, or necessarily enough education, or in some cases intelligence, to assemble that many facts in their knowledge bank. That I'm choosing would be Petrus and Eric Ibarra, because these men are exceptions to the rule. They are pretty much the pinnacle of lay scholarship, I would say. And of course, if you're saying that only scholars can know, like professional scholars, then the field is just getting even more restricted, and the set of facts is just arguably getting wider and wider, and harder for the common person to realistically be expected to absorb. And what that means, again, is that most people, even if they're in good faith, are basically just guessing. But the problem with any non-Catholic church is there's no way to know that it is the true church based on pedigree or origin alone, or structural features alone. You have to be able to deduce that a non-Catholic church is the true church based on the fact that non-Catholic church ostensibly has true doctrine, whereas the Catholic Church does not, at least on the non-Catholic view. Only if the Catholic Church is correct in what it teaches is there a non-theological way to identify the true church, namely the papacy, the method of just finding out who the Pope is. Because if the Catholic Church is correct in what it teaches, then the Pope is infallible, which is a theological fact in and of itself. So understand, when I mean non-theological, I mean with the exception of that one, with the exception of the one theological claim that is implicit in the claim that the Pope is infallible, or that finding the Pope is sufficient to identify the true church. And so I'm concluding that the Catholic Church is the true church, based on this. So this is if all the premises are true. The premise that might be challenged is the premise that says that someone might say that it is, there's a set of facts that lets you know that some non-Catholic church is true, sort of easily and obviously. It's a narrow range of facts. It's a small set of facts. But the problem is, the smaller the set of facts you put forward, the harder it is to really plausibly claim that it lets you know that the church is the true church, because it seemingly forces you to the conclusion that everybody else who is aware of that small set of facts, that minimal set of facts, is in bad faith or intellectually dishonest, which they're probably not. There are tremendously intelligent and tremendously educated people on all sides, or on all points of the ecclesial map, let's say. But then the wider the set of facts, the more plausibly you can say that it lets you know what the true church is, but the harder it is for the average person to reach. So someone might dispute premise 5, but I think that one is solid. It's truly important for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence. Then God, yeah. So if it's important for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence, then God will have ensured that it is realistically possible for the average person to identify the true church with high confidence. So God doesn't want people to be guessing, because otherwise they're missing out on the fullness of correct theology when they guess wrong, because it's inevitable they'll guess wrong. The only way you can get everything right on a test is if you know the material. If you're guessing, most of the time you won't get everything right. Most people won't get, if of all the people who are guessing, only one or two will get most or all things right. The rest will be wrong. God doesn't want anyone to be wrong or miss out. So he wants it to be possible to identify the true church with high confidence. And so premise 2, it's saying like if it's important if the fullness of correct theology is important to have. No, I guess I'm back at premise 3. If it's important for a person to have the fullness of correct theology, then there has to be a way for them to obtain it. If God expects them to have this, or really wants them to have this, then he's going to have made a way. And I'm going to argue that way is not theological knowledge, because that by itself is too hard for the average person to obtain. Functionally average people are just forced to guess. That there is a true church, again, like there's a truth gradient with theological ideas. There's like a slope. Some are less true, some are more true. And there's sort of a fullness at the top of the slope, notionally. If there's not really a true church, there's no point to the discussion. I'm not saying that I know that this is the case. I'm not saying I know that there really is a true church. I'm just saying if there isn't, then the question of which one is the true church doesn't really matter. And so, yeah, I'm saying that it's basically you got one or the other. You got the papacy or theological knowledge, because for every non-Catholic church, the only way you can identify it as the true church is using your own theological knowledge. Now, I mean, there's more to it than that. In my full-length presentation, I'm going to discuss other ways that it could be claimed that you can know that the true church is the true church. I'm going to argue that, they may represent ways of knowing that the true church is on the true church on rare that the true church is the true church on rare occasions, but that they're exceptional circumstances and not the rule, and that generally, if the intellectual case is not clear or obvious to start with, it's not going to be made clearer by the addition or by supplementing it with these other ways of knowing, like maybe beauty, superlative beauty is a way that lets you know that the true church is the true church, or maybe the holiness of its people, or maybe the frequency of miracles or certain kind of miracles. These are maybe ways of knowing that don't rest on personal sort of intellectual study, but I'm going to argue that those, I'm not ruling out that they could serve as knowledge of the true church. Maybe God just gives you an inner sense that you know. But I'm saying, if these things happen, I mean, these methods are either not reliable enough, or they're too rare for it to really take the case for the true church, the non-papal case for the true church, from non-obvious to obvious. The case starts as a merely intellectual case. You can supplement it with these other ways of knowing, but ultimately, I think sprinkling those in, it doesn't really get you anywhere. The case is either clear enough for the average person with the sort of theological study portion of it, or it's not, because adding these others doesn't take it from not clear enough to clear enough. And I'm going to expand on that more in my full-length presentation. And of course, someone could say there are other non-theological ways to know what the true church is. Like maybe, I don't know, it's the church that is part of the Southern Baptist Association or something. Like, to find the true church, it is sufficient to find any church in the Southern Baptist Association. But these are they're not really plausible by nature. The papacy has a sort of plausibility to it because it's based on Matthew 16. It's also based on many church fathers, based on maybe, there are sections in about 3 ecumenical councils that really sort of established the idea of the infallibility of the papacy and its divine institution. So and the Catholic interpretations of Matthew 16 are just better, in my humble opinion, because it seems to me that the non-Catholic interpretations are essentially tautological. So what I mean is that in the non-Catholic interpretation of the promise of indefectibility, that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church that Jesus is founding on the rock, for the non-Catholic, the rock is not necessarily Peter, and so the church against which the gates of hell will not prevail is, that's the church that is the true church, is always going to be correct on everything, but you don't really a priori know which church that is. So Jesus is effectively just saying the true church that has correct doctrine, that has all correct doctrine, is always going to be the true church that has all correct doctrine, but that doesn't really help you because you don't know what the true church is. And there's not really a reason to mention that, because it's trivially obvious, but the pressing question of which church that is left unanswered. There are other ways, like how do I, similarly you can ask, how do I know that I'm in that church, if it's not necessarily built on the rock of the successors of Peter, or you can say, how do I know that the promise is still in effect, because maybe the Sede Vacantis assume that the end times, during the actual end times, like the visible church can fall away. That it was only indefectible like right up until the end times, but during the end times it's not. But that's a problem because all we really know about the end times is that we're commanded to more or less assume that they're always happening. Because if you assume that it's not happening, that's when it's going to happen. It's going to come like a thief in the night. You got to keep your lamps. You got to always have enough oil for your lamps, etc. All these proverbs. So you're supposed to always sort of live in the expectation of the return of the Messiah. But if that's the case, then you're always supposed to live in the expectation that the whole visible church can have fallen away. But then that again means that the promise of indefectibility is nullified. There's no guarantee. There's no meaningful guarantee anymore on the non-Catholic interpretation. I mean, Sede Vacantis called himself Catholic, but I mean the non-mainstream Catholic interpretation. So in other words, I would say the Catholic Church is the only one that has a plausible claim to having a non-theological method for finding the true church. So I'm saying in the end, it really comes down to just, you either can find the true church based on your own knowledge of doctrine and your own personal study, but the catch is, if you can't or you can find it by identifying the Pope, but the catch is, unless you can do the former with in such a way that it lets you find the true church with high confidence, then you actually have to conclude that it's the latter that is what lets you find the true church with high confidence, because assuming is necessary for people to find the true church, there has to be a way to identify it with high confidence. And someone might be highly confident in the choice that they make based on personal study, but I'm saying for us empirical observers who look at the totality of decisions by most believers, it's like what we see is that most of the time it looks like they're just guessing. They can't all be right. So that means most of them are making unprincipled or uneducated. How do I want to put it? They're making bad guesses, even if they think they're making good guesses, or don't even think they're guessing, even if they think they know. So we know that for the average person, that route does not let you identify the church with high confidence. So it must be the other method that does. That's my argument. Let's go in a little bit more into why. Validity. So again, a valid argument means that the conclusion follows from the premises. Premises may not all be true, but if they are true, then the conclusion is true. for a valid argument. I think that this argument is at least valid. I also think it's sound because I think all the premises are true. But and I guess in my full-length presentation, I'll talk more about why one thinks that theology is important. Part of it is that if you think Christianity is like the most true religion, and every other religion is either not true at all or it just has less truth, and that Christianity is at least the fullness of the truth, and maybe in the limit we would say that it's the only true one. That's an example of theology mattering right there. Theology matters when it comes to religions, but so I don't really understand why once one enters the ambit of Christianity and one is just now totally inside the Christian religion, I don't understand why theology would stop mattering there. It seems to me also that, so in other words, there must be a fullness of truth within Christianity, or one church that is just true and the others are just not true. And it seems to me that if this true church has the fullness of correct theology, then the sort of cash value of the truth of that true theology is that it brings you closer to God and maximizes your chances of salvation. Because if it doesn't do either of those things, it's not really clear what value it has at all within the Christian system. So, I think that theology is important like that, as a matter of the truth of my premises. But right now, let me just restrict myself to commenting on its validity. I think this argument is valid for some method to work with high confidence. It is not necessary for one to know that it works with high confidence, or to be confident that it works with high confidence, at least not initially. And in this case, one does know that it works, the method that is, albeit by process of elimination. All right, so here's a thought experiment. Suppose I hand you a dozen strange items and tell you that one of them is a wumple, and that you must identify the wumple for me, but only when you are very sure that you have identified the wumple, because a wrong answer will cost you more money than you can ever repay. I hand you two more items, one of which is a magic wand that supposedly identifies wumples, and the other of which is a heavy, dense technical manual that goes on for over 3,000 pages about wumple details. I further tell you that with one or the other of these two items, even an average person can identify a wumple with high confidence and no great period of preparation. Let's say I tell you, oh yeah, you can do it in 5 minutes. That's all you need. And you scan through the manual, but it's full of technical jargon and diagrams that you can't make heads or tails of. You quickly ascertain that you would not be able to master its content even after a lifetime of study, so what to speak of 5 minutes. But assuming that I am truthful and I am correct in everything that I say, do you know that the wand will let you identify the wumple with high confidence? So again, to simplify the logic, what we know is that with one of these or the other, I mean the exclusive or, not the potentially both and or, but with one or the other of these is going to let me identify a wumple with high confidence. But I look at the manual and I don't really see anything that's letting me make a clear determination among the candidates for the wumple which one is in fact a wumple. I'm honest about the fact that I don't really understand anything in this manual. I'm honest with myself about that. So by inference, even though I might be skeptical of the wand, it has to be the wand. And I'm going to say just a little bit more about that. So yeah, I believe the argument is valid. And that in the thought experiment, the wand will let you identify the wumple with high confidence. And I think the key to this is that while you may not know that the wand works, you do not know that it does not work either. That's really the key. In Donald Rumsfeld terms, like if anyone remembers the invasion of Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld, I think it was, said that there are known knowns and known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. So the manual is kind of a known unknown, at least once you look through it. But the wand is at least initially it's just it's an unknown unknown, I guess you could say. But then after you look through the manual and realize that's not letting you tell what a wumple is, then you move to the fact that the wand will let you know what a wumple is, because one or the other of these must let you know. And in the beginning, it seems like possibly this, possibly that, but you look into the first one and you realize, oh, not possibly this, so necessarily that. It's this kind of argument. And I believe it follows from the importance of theology in this case, and the necessity of everyone being able to find the church, that you can make this conclusion. So I'm really saying it's the same thing with the papacy for the purposes of my argument. I guess a lot of people think they know that it's not real, but I think most people, if they're honest, will admit that, well, it's not that I know that the papacy is not real or valid or infallible or whatever. It's that I just have no great reason to believe that it is. Kind of like in the thought experiment, you have no great reason initially to think that a wand will be magical and work. Maybe it's just a piece of plastic. I mean, that's what it looks like. I never seen a magic wand, so then again, I never saw a wumple either. But so it's this thing. The papacy is like that. I would submit that if you're holding to all of the premises in my argument, unless you disagree with one of my premises, then you're in a different category. But if you disagree with one of my premises, you're in a different category. But if you accept all the premises in my argument as true, that means that you don't know that the papacy is false. You don't know that it's true, but you don't know that it's false either. So once you realize that the first option won't work, then you realize that the papacy has to work if it's the only other option, which I'm submitting it is. So if you know that, so I'll just read the slide here. The key to this whole thing is that while you may not know that the wand works, you do not know that it does not work either. Same thing with the papacy. But if you know that the one option does not work, you know that the one or the other, if you know that the one option does not work and you know that one or the other of them must work, then you know that the other option must work, even if this fact was not initially obvious, I should stress. All right, so that is the simple argument in a nutshell. I should cap it off here because otherwise it will take too long for my video to upload to YouTube. May already take quite a bit at this length, but hopefully not. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. Hopefully it wasn't too strange or too out there. Questions, comments, feedback, welcome. Thank you for listening. God bless you.